Hello, 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 and welcome. Welcome to this session. What kind of future do we want and who gets to decide? Hello to our online audience who have dialed in, just to say welcome to them and to say at the end there will be questions and a roaming mic will go around the auditorium. Please wait for the mic so that the online audience can hear what your question is. The event is being recorded and will be uploaded afterwards, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as we possibly can at the end. Okay, let's start. So I'm Anna Middleton. I'm a geneticist and also a psychologist, and this is Richard. He is a sociologist with a specific interest in AI and genetics. And this is Catherine. She's a journalist and broadcaster. And the three of us are the leadership team for the newly formed Kavli Centre for Ethics, Science and the Public, based in the Faculty of Education at the university, which launched a few months ago. Next slide. No, not yet. We're academics who research how to make connections between science and society. We're going to tell you a story about one of the biggest scientific breakthroughs in genetics in recent years and our part in bringing global public audiences into discussions about it. We're going to make a case for multidisciplinary approaches to tackling the ethical issues raised by cutting-edge science. And we're going to invite you after this lecture to talk directly with scientists from across Cambridge about their hopes and fears about their science. Often what happens is that science is shared with the public at the end of a process, when the results are known and the meaning of these have already been decided, or in the worst case scenario after it has gone wrong or gone too far. It is really quite rare for public audiences to be brought in at the beginning of a scientific journey to co-design or contribute to the conceptual framings. And if you are a scientist, you may already be thinking of reasons as to why this may be too unrealistic or too idealistic a proposition. Despite more than 30 years of investment in research into the ethical, legal and social issues raised by science, such as genetics and AI, as well as hundreds of policy documents that call for the need to build trust with the public, we still don't have clear, evidence-based methods for scaling up conversations between scientists and publics, nor methods for radiating diverse public opinion across the science landscape. What we do know, however, is that for many, just talking about the science on its own puts many people off. What we need to figure out is where is the common ground in the conversation? What does the hello look like? And so this is where our centre comes in. In effect, what we are doing is an experiment. Our hypothesis is that if we create purposeful connections between scientists and the public early in the research process to discuss on a level playing field what discovery science means for our shared future, then this means we can better anticipate the ethical issues that might arise in the future. And we assume that this in of itself will be a good thing. Put simply, if we all feel we have more skin in the game with science, does this provide better outcomes for us in society? So we aim to find out. At the heart of what we do is explore human connections, and thus we aim to draw from experts who already know how to do this in other disciplines, whether they are counsellors, filmmakers, or social media influencers. Innovation and creativity is at the heart of everything we do. So I'll now hand over to Catherine to continue our story.
Hello, everyone. Well, as you've just heard, the Kavli Centre exists as a space more than anything, a space to build a community of scientists, ethicists, and us, the public. A space where we could talk about the science that has significant power to shape a future that we all already own. A space to reflect together on the kind of future we actually want, one which will be beneficial to everybody equally. And right from our own very first conversation about what this centre could and should do and look like, how it could and should work, we knew that the ways that we engaged with society had to be as smart as the science itself. In other words, we decided to start just like scientists do, with the what if and not with the what is. We decided to connect with world-class storytellers from the creative industries, from film, from advertising, from the arts, from social media, and to ask them how best to relate. How to relate brilliantly, empoweringly to each other, and how to relate better to difficult and challenging things. So to show, not tell, you what I'm talking about, I'd like to show you the trailer for an award-winning documentary on the gene editing technology CRISPR, which is what we're going to be talking about together today. The film is called Human Nature. It's available now on Netflix, and it's made by an amazing team of science filmmakers in the States called the Wonder Collaborative. We're already in touch with them about finding a way to work together in the future because we love what they do. But for now, here's the story of how a Nobel Prize-winning science began in salt flats in Spain and in a pot of yogurt in the States.
Mother Nature gave us something that's richer than our imagination.
We saw a very peculiar pattern.
Never seen anything like this before.
I remember him saying, remember this word, CRISPR.
We've never had the ability to change the fundamental chemical nature of who we are, and now we do. And what do we do with that?
So this doctor told me, just hold on, there's something coming.
You can actually use CRISPR to change DNA. You can actually do it.
We could engineer a single gene that could potentially make us all more muscular. But should we make that universally available?
Что человек может создавать человека, человек, который может воевать без страха и без боли. И вот то, о чем я сейчас сказал, может быть страшнее ядерной бомбы.
Should we really be manipulating the heredity of future generations, given our lack of knowledge about so many things?
I don't know where you draw the line between not having albinism and deciding your kid needs to be an extra foot taller so they can be a good oarsman and go to Yale. Where is that line? Who's going to draw that?
Anything that will stop my child from suffering, I'm for.
You know, draw this ethical line wherever you want, but don't draw it in front of my disease.
What does that mean for this science, where we have the capacity to edit in some things that we think are important? Are we playing God?
You don't realize it's disruptive until you look backward. Often you don't realize that you're in the middle of a revolution until after the revolution has occurred.
So there we are, that's Human Nature. And if anyone wants any more science in their day, I suggest you go to Netflix and watch that this evening. The words you heard at the end of that trailer were spoken by the American professor of law and bioethicist Alta Charo, and they really made me pause. She says, often you don't realize you're in the middle of a revolution until after the revolution has occurred. Now, as a journalist, I'm used to reporting from the midst of revolutions. My job involves trying to make sense of a moment in the eye of the storm. That's where news lives. But when we talk about revolutionary science, not anticipating disruptive consequences can cause really serious ethical problems. Not getting ahead of that story and addressing the incoming change means that often we're horrified, blindsided, not ready, or simply passive when the future happens to us. Sometimes it even happens without us. Alta Charo calls this moment that we are all living in together the century of biology. CRISPR and associated technology really is that big. So what if we had the big conversations too earlier on? What if we opened up a space just ahead of that revolution when we had time to work out what we thought still? What if we invited everyone? What difference might that make? Well, this is the experiment that we're undertaking here at the Kavli Centre, and for the rest of this lecture, we're going to show you what that might look like in real life. But first, let's pause just once at the very moment when a revolution occurred. It was in Hong Kong, it was in late November 2018, and Anna was right there in the middle of it.
So I took this photograph at a conference in Hong Kong in 2018. What you can see here is the white heat of camera flashes from the world's press surrounding a single scientist, Hu Jiankui. Moments earlier, he'd stepped onto the stage at the second International Summit of Gene Editing. Prior to this, he'd leaked the outcome of his secret experiments, and that's why the press were present. Here he is about to take the podium to explain that he had used CRISPR technologies to edit the DNA of several human embryos. He'd implanted these into women with the deliberate intention of creating the world's first edited human beings. He proudly announced that 2 baby girls called Lulu and Lana had recently been born the previous month, and a 3rd baby was about to be born. I was in the audience and heard an audible and collective gasp, and then silence. And then the cameras started to flash. And then he seemed to read the room. He gave an overly technical presentation that focused more on the science than the impact on humankind. And once he'd finished, we all rushed up to the mic to ask questions. I had actually been invited to the conference to talk about our own research from before we set up our current centre, exploring the attitudes of 37,000 people from 22 countries, data gathered in 16 languages on public trust in genetic research. And yet none of that seemed to matter, as in an instant, a single scientist who really couldn't care less about societal attitudes had forged ahead with his own agenda. He arrived at this conference expecting a Nobel Prize, and he ended up with a prison sentence. And the families he targeted are now in hiding. So this was 4 years ago, and society is on the back foot. There has since been a flurry of activity in terms of policy popping up all around the world, including from the WHO and the United Nations. Some calling for an outright ban, others creating a pathway of conditions that need to be in place before clinical application can be considered. And one common principle across the board is a consistent call for public engagement on the issue, but very little advice on how this should be gathered, nor how we would know when it was complete. Irrespective of all of this, I personally left the conference feeling somewhat bereft. There was an uneasy power dynamic with so many missing voices. I wondered, how do we bring together public voices at scale in a democratic way on a global level? After leaving Hong Kong, I connected with academics from the University of Canberra, who are experts in the convening of global citizens' assemblies, and we started to scope out plans for an international public project. And this is where I'll hand over to Richard to delve deeper into what happened since 2018.
Thanks, Anna. And thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon. And it's great to see you all here and everybody online as well. So as Anna mentioned, I'm a sociologist by background. I've been working for a long time with Anna, and before that on questions around the relationship between science and the public, particularly as it relates to new scientific innovation, cutting edge science, and the ethical questions that raises. So what I'm going to do is just take us back a step from Hong Kong in 2018 and just give a bit of background to CRISPR and where that came from and the questions that it raises. So as Catherine mentioned, CRISPR is a story that starts in the late 1980s with the kind of identification of unusual genetic sequences in bacteria that by the kind of mid-2000s had been identified as being what was essentially a bacterial immune system. It was a very precise way that bacteria could cut bits of genome from viruses, put them into their own genome, and then recognize those viruses in the future. The real leap came in 2012 with the work of Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, who used this technique to provide a tool for really precise editing of any genome. So making something that took a long time, cost a lot of money before, and was imprecise, into something that now people are selling kind of high school kits in the US to use CRISPR in kind of equivalent of sixth form. And so this was science's breakthrough of the year in 2015. Doudna and Charpentier won the Nobel Prize in 2020. But alongside that longer history of CRISPR is a much longer history of the relationship between genetics and society and the ethical questions associated with genetics. Going back to the late 19th century and discussions around eugenics, through the 20th century to where I started my own research, which was around the genetically modified crops debate in the UK. And as soon as CRISPR technology became available, as Anna mentioned, this discussion started, particularly in places like the Royal Society, the World Health Organization, the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine in the States, producing recommendations around what we should do with this technology. What were the kind of acceptable uses of it? Anna, can you? Yeah, thanks. And so this involved some of the same people who've been involved in the science. So this is Jennifer Doudna, interviewed immediately after the Hong Kong case, He Jiankui's experiment, talking about how she felt deeply disappointed. And one of the reasons some of the reasons were around questions of the science and the kind of appropriate experimental procedure. So one of the huge problems with He Jiankui's work was that he had no evidence of safety, never mind whether he should have done it, he didn't know whether it was safe. And this is the kind of first question for this technology. Is it safe? But there were also much broader questions around what does the fact that we can edit in or out particular characteristics mean for how we as a society relate to people with disabilities and genetic conditions? What does it mean in terms of access? If some people can access the technology and others can't, and how do we draw the line between enabling people to, say, edit to prevent a genetic disease, a serious genetic disease, and edit, as in the trailer, edit so that you can be a foot taller and be a good rower? So where do we draw those lines, and who do we allow to have access to them? How do we even know that the people that we're editing can consent to this? These people aren't born yet. How can they be informed about what's happening to them? And these are really, really difficult ethical questions. They're really difficult scientific questions. But one of the places that every single report around this has come down on is this idea that, in the words of science policy scholar Sheila Jasanoff, that they're not questions, they're not narrowly technical questions. The human genome belongs to everybody. And decisions about what we do to the human genome have to be accountable to humanity as a whole. Or in the words of the first of the summits on human gene editing, they have to be socially acceptable. But what does that mean? How do we even do that? Because as Anna mentioned, so Anna and I have done these big surveys in the past, so we can tell you what 37,000 people around the world think about how their DNA data should be used, or who they trust with their DNA data. But asking somebody a question at a moment of time in a survey is very different from having the kinds of reasoned decisions, engaging with really complex technical questions that you would want to be able to ensure this kind of question of accountability, to ensure that you've reached a reasoned decision. And this is where this word deliberation and deliberative methods come in. So deliberative methods have been growing in popularity. You may have seen them on the news. So there was a big climate assembly, for example, in the UK, bringing together citizens from across the UK to think about what are socially acceptable changes that we might make to our lifestyle in the future in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. And they're a method that allows members of the public to engage directly with experts and evidence over a period of time through a process of learning to come to a kind of reasoned conclusion. And people like Anna and myself and the people that we've worked with, so particularly an organization called Involve, who are experts in deliberative approaches, act as facilitators of that process, essentially. So if you take the model that we've used, which is called a citizen's jury, and that Anna's going to tell you in a bit more detail about in a minute. So a citizen's jury is a small group of people, about 15 to 25 usually. And in that sense, it's kind of similar to, slightly bigger than, but similar to a normal legal jury that you might normally talk about in this room. But the citizens' jury are provided with background information on the topic that they're discussing, which kind of gives an introduction to the area, in this case, gene editing. They come together as a small number of people in an incredibly intensive process of being together day in, day out for a week or so to talk about, argue about, hear from experts on the topic of interest. So through that process, they then produce a set of recommendations. Again, the idea is that this set of recommendations comes from the jury. It's not something that, that's dropped in from outside. It's through that process of reasoning and deliberation. And so our work that we've been doing has formed part of what's going to be a global process where the same types of citizens' juries are happening in Australia, in Belgium, in Brazil, in various other countries around the world. But in terms of what that actually looks like, I will hand you back to Anna.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the scene setting that we gave our jurors. And before I do that, it's worth actually saying that 1 in 12 of us will have a rare single gene inherited condition. So there will be a few people here with genetic conditions. Conditions like muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, young onset cancer, thalassemia, sickle cell. On their own, these are quite unusual, but collectively, there are so many of them that genetic disease is considered quite common. We use the term genetics patient to refer to individuals with a genetic condition as well as those who are at risk of developing one or passing one on. The backdrop in the UK is that it is currently illegal to edit human embryos to deliberately lead to a pregnancy. However, it is legal to do research on embryos up to 14 days, and then these embryos must be destroyed. We were aware that the Genomics Policy Unit at the Department of Health and Social Care were following the global discussions around embryo editing very closely. We were also aware that the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act was due to be discussed to see if revisions were needed. And so we contacted the policymakers from both to ask advice on what question we should ask our citizens' jury. It became really clear that they would find it helpful to know if there was a push in the UK from genetics patients wanting to challenge the law to use the editing of embryos to cure serious genetic disease. It's worth saying that it's already legal in the UK to offer pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or testing of embryos that have been created via IVF. The embryos are tested for specific genetic conditions, and those that are unaffected are implanted. The process only works well if there are a lot of embryos to test and a choice of good quality, unaffected ones to implant. And as anyone who's had IVF knows, getting to the stage where you have a lot of embryos to choose from is a very difficult task. The benefit of being able to edit embryos is that, in theory, you'd only need one or at the very least a small number. And of course, this is all on the premise that the editing is accurate and safe. Given all of this, we wanted to ask genetics patients what they thought about changing the DNA of human embryos to potentially cure genetic disease in future generations. For our citizens' jury, we partnered with a national umbrella organisation for genetics patients and randomly selected 21 individuals from across the UK with a variety of demographic backgrounds. The thing about citizens' juries is that even though the number of participants is small, what they have in their favour is that the juries allow for nuanced, reflective, structured debate over many days. How many of us can say that we're given this freedom to really become experts in the technically challenging and ethically contentious piece of science that has the potential to impact on all of humankind? For us, we had 4.5 days. And as with any legal jury, the jurors get to hear evidence from experts. And so we brought in experts in science, ethics, religion, clinical practice, regulation, and policy. The jurors deliberated on the meaning of suffering, the definitions of serious disease, the rights of the embryo, the rights to have a genetically related child, the philosophical positions on when life begins. We held our jury last week, so I want to say something about what it felt like to be in the room. It was painful to hear parents of children who had died asking why they couldn't get access to the technology now. It was humbling to hear from adults who had genetic conditions, who saw their genetic condition as integral to their identity and sense of self. It was heartbreaking to hear the frustrations from families who couldn't get access to even basic levels of health and social care, who were questioning why expensive new technologies were even being discussed. It was frightening to hear the stories of stigma and discrimination and mistrust. Would the children born from edited embryos have protected rights and characteristics? What I can say is it was incredibly moving, and I personally felt the weight of responsibility to capture and tell these stories in the report that we're now writing and the film that we are now making. One of the key features of many of the citizens' juries on genome editing around the world is that they are also filmed projects. This was baked into the design, and we have the capacity and the consent to join our footage with the footage from other juries as part of a documentary series. So we now have an ability to draw together, collate and represent a whole plethora of public voices in a very easily accessible format. In my next slide, I'd like to show you a little bit of film from the week so you get a flavour of what it looked like. Also baked into the design of our jury was the commitment we made to feed the results and recommendations into policy, not only in the UK but also globally, and to join up with other citizens' juries around the world and discover whether it is possible to reach a level of consensus on any of the issues. Our Citizens Jury project is just one of many different projects that we have planned for our new Kavli Centre for Ethics, Science and the Public. And whilst we'll start with genetics and in time AI and big data, in the years to come, we will amplify the engagement methods we have learned here and branch out into other areas of science. Our plans are to deliver large-scale global public surveys in multiple languages to explore the ethical issues raised by science the public audiences feel are important. We'll also be doing in-depth ethnographic inquiry into the way scientists think about society and their work. linguistics research on the meaning of scientific terms amongst minority ethnic groups, creative projects involving big budget film companies exploring the hello to accessing science, the creation of an Ethics in Science film festival with input from our collaborators in Japan, China, India and Russia, creation of a psychometrically validated measure of engagement, the delivery of an ethics drop-in clinic, and a toolkit for scientists on reflective ethical practice training, as well as a sustained programme of activities to connect scientists and members of the public to share ideas about the impact of science on society. Equity, diversity and inclusion are underpinning values in everything that we do, and we have a particular interest in reaching hard-to-reach communities who wouldn't usually feel that science is for them. There are several centres across the university that have the words public policy in their title, and of course we have the most incredible public engagement team that serves up multiple opportunities for scientists to connect with public audiences already. However, as far as we know, we're the only centre at the university whose fundamental mission is to deliver sustained scholarship on how to communicate effectively and in scalable ways across different scientific disciplines and across different public audiences around the ethical issues raised by cutting-edge science. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our centre and how it came about. The Kavli Foundation are a philanthropic organisation that fund science centres and institutes around the world, the majority of which are at Ivy League universities in the US. They founded the Kavli Institute for Cosmology at the university, an institute that Stephen Hawking helped to set up. The Kavli Foundation approached Cambridge. They asked if the university would pitch for a new centre, and the development office reached out to Richard and myself to lead the bid. There was a very intensive and competitive process that culminated in an 8-hour interview, and soon after we heard we were successful, and so too with our colleagues from UC Berkeley, led by AI scientist Stuart Russell. We have secured 5 years funding, and if we review well at the 4-year point, then the Kavli Foundation will offer endowed funding so that the centre will exist in perpetuity. One of the conditions, however, is that we seek out some level of matched funding, which the Development Office is leading on. Part of our motivation in partnering with the Alumni Festival for this event was to sow the seeds within the alumni family to help us reach potential donors who are interested in coming on the journey with us to build our centre, and I'll leave that hanging with you. Before we invite you to take part in our Hopes and Fears Labs, which is another event that's happening today that connects you directly with 7 scientists from Cambridge, I wanted to finish with the film that we made to go with our grant application. This demonstrates what we do in a way that has so much more depth than the words in a grant. We wanted to show, not tell. Here is the film we made about our ambition.
Visuomenė yra atskirta nuo mokslo.
There's a lot of purposeful misinformation out there.
Menjin di sɛ megye abɔdeɛ mu nyansapɛfoɔ di sɛ ɔmo wɔ me ho adwene pa ɛwɔ ɔmo akoma mu.
Ja mislim da je fantastična ideja da nađemo bolje metode da komuniciramo nauku.
In order to advance science for the benefit and well-being of humanity, we need to engage with everyday people from across the world. Big scientific advances may bring with them complex ethical issues. For example, artificial intelligence and machine learning are all around us. We live amid a stream of big data generated by devices, sequencing machines, to smartphones. A powerful genetic editing tool means it's possible for us to make changes to the DNA of all living things. Plants, animals, to humans. We need to create more opportunities for scientists and society to connect. To initiate and foster debate about the ethical issues raised by the latest cutting-edge science. To build a bridge for a two-way conversation that is not only heard, but also acted upon. To bring a new dimension to conversations between the scientific community and the wider public in all its diversification.
Still gives me goosebumps, that one. That's how a small team got quite a big deal to come to Cambridge. As I hope we've experienced today, being in the room together, even virtually, is a pretty powerful thing, and it takes us in all sorts of unexpected directions. As we've heard, it is the century of biology and technology, and it's high time that we stepped up and connected. But sometimes that can be pretty daunting, scary even. Some of us don't really know what to think, and scientists are still working it out. So what hope do the rest of us have? And yet it's human nature to hope for the best. And those feelings, hope and fear, are things we have in common, no matter what we do as our day job. In the room last week at the citizens' jury, one of the citizens' jurors took me by the arm to check she really had my attention, tapped me and said, "You write these words down, Catherine, in our lifetime. That's why I'm here. That's what this is all about. That's the urgency. That's the mission." So what if we didn't leave it at the 1-hour lecture today? What would happen if we sat down together afterwards and carried on talking? What if we built a pop-up science lab right here at the Alumni Festival, where we could experiment with a different way for us all to connect? And what if people came? Once I'd had that idea, my first call was to a brilliant artist and illustrator, Tom McLean, who said, "What if we drew the change we wanted to see?" And then he drew it on cardboard boxes. My next calls were to scientists who are working on the innovations that will shape our future in the coming years, but which you'll struggle to find mentioned in your daily newspapers just yet. 7 of them, very bravely, agreed to come and sit in the lab and talk to you today about their own hopes and fears surrounding the work that they do, and then ask you for your reactions in return. They're small chats, just 15 minutes each, about big issues. And apparently even scientists can talk about their feelings for that long, I've heard. So here's a little look at how this works. Could I have the next slide, Anna? 5 easy steps, 7 lovely scientists. And I'd just like to say how very, very grateful I am that they agreed to do this. It's very much one from the Department of Crazy Ideas, but they'd be delighted to see you over there if you'd like to give it a go. Some of you have booked already, but there is still space if you'd like to come after the lecture. I've given Anna her own cardboard lab bench to talk more about the citizens' jury work. But you can also meet people today working on cancer, cardiology, and cell development, as well as brain implantables, machine learning, and CRISPR itself. I should say you'll also encounter a film crew there because, as you've probably gathered, we love filming things at the Kavli Centre. But for those of you who prefer to ask your questions in the traditional way, either by the chat now or with that old chestnut, the roving microphone, we have left space for that. So I will hand over to the festival team now. And if any of you have got any questions, please feel free to ask them. Thanks for listening. Here we go. Hands up already. Love it.
So we've actually got a question from an online participant. Paul Gerbert would like to know, how do you stop your work being trashed by fake news on social media?
I don't think we actually can. I don't think we have that level of power. I think what's underneath that is something about the use of popular culture, really. And often we, you know, encounter the argument, well, you know, there's crazy news stories, there's, you know, the way genetics is represented in film, for example, the way it's discussed isn't accurate in film. And often what we say is, you know, we want a springboard to start a conversation. So if the springboard is off X-Men, or if it's off Gattaca, or if it's some way that the science is represented in popular culture on social media, then we'll take that springboard. I don't think we can really control the trash, but we can certainly divert it and springboard off it.
We could also be there too. We could also be, I mean, it's worth mentioning that about 60% of the younger generation get their news from TikTok, not just their fun, but their news and their information. So if that's the case, we need to be there. We need to be making content that they can access that is reliable, ethically correct, rigorous, and that is actual proper information. So if anyone's going to share anything, they're going to share our stuff, we hope. Oh, yes, more questions.
Thanks. A somewhat related question. I've had some involvement with deliberative assemblies and co-creation in public policy. And one of the criticisms you get is, but that group of people don't represent me. So how do you make sure in putting your jury together, or a wider assembly, or a group of assemblies, that you are representing the public in its widest distribution?
So you're never ever going to represent the public in its widest distribution. That's an absolute impossible task. All we can do is a good enough job at having a go at picking you know, who we can. We know there are whole sections of society that would never engage with any of this. You know, whole sections of society, people in prison, people with mental health problems, people caring for terminally ill people. You know, there's a whole sections of people who are not awake enough to be engaging with this. So we have to be very thoughtful about how we go out and reach hard to reach communities. But none of us in this space ever claim that we fully represent the views of the whole world, because we're not there asking the whole world. Do you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I think it's a really so I do a lot of like small scale qualitative research where that same question comes up, but I think particularly for the deliberative work, being the kind of clarity of the question and who you need to talk to answer that question, I think is really important. So in this case, because we had a question with a clear steer from policy as to who is likely to be potentially pushing for policy change, that made it for our recruitment, that helped clarify. I think if one's talking about a larger kind of policy question, maybe where it's where your aim is to get a kind of broader public, then obviously the sampling question is really important, but also what you might be trying to do is not necessarily a representativeness in a kind of statistical sense, but in representing the range of discourses that are going on, and trying to ensure that all of the discourses around a topic that are circulating in society, the positions that people have, are brought into that room, regardless of whether it's 60% of people who hold them or 10%. It's that they need to be part of that conversation. But I think it depends on the process and where you're trying to get to.
Is the microphone coming?
Hello there.
I was going to ask, what are your plans for including schools in all of this? Because you were looking at including everybody and teaching in a very inclusive school, Academy of Schools. It would be a way of preparing the ground. I appreciate the little people, but little people will grow up to be adults. And again, a lot of them say to me, why are we learning about IVF, miss? I said, because at some point in your life, you may have to make the decisions that we're discussing in biology, but they are ethical debates that we're having. Genetic modification, another one that's in the spec at the moment. Should CRISPR be in the spec now and that we can start these ethical discussions in schools?
Yes, and so I should have said that in the Kavli Centre we exist as a partnership between the university and also Wellcome Connecting Science, which is based at the Wellcome Genome campus 10 miles south of the university. And there we have a very significant schools programme where we go out and do outreach to go and do train the teachers in how to teach genetics and to talk about society and genetics in the curriculum. And we also have extensive programmes of bringing kids to campus to come and see how science is done, how genetics is done. We have a particular strategy also to target schools that on the Ofsted and the other ratings for social deprivation. So we particularly target schools that have high proportion of free school meals, for example, to bring kids to campus when they may never have had an opportunity to interact with scientists and also teachers. Also, Catherine has a specific interest in this as well. I don't know if you want to say about the Abbey School and possible future projects.
Sure. I mean, the Hopes and Fears Lab, which is coming later this afternoon, is one of the things that we would love to bring. We would like to bring science clubs, after-school science clubs for schools that perhaps don't even have a science lab at all. That needs to be free. It needs to be available to everybody. The glorious thing about where we're situated at the university is we're in the Faculty of Education. And the reason we're specifically there is because they also have a research interest in how to reach hard-to-reach groups, how to engage in a different way, not just do your standard textbook stuff. So I feel the schools team that Anna and Richard already work with, plus the backup from the Faculty of Education who are really excited to have us, plus the real commitment to reaching people who just don't get things ever, and that's not fair. I mean, Anna got me on board of this project. She kind of got my heart when she said, Catherine, I don't want you to reach the people who would always come to a science festival. I want you to reach the people in Tesco's car park. And as I spend quite a lot of time in Tesco's car park, I thought I can do that. So that's what we need is definitely earlier on. I mean, for example, when we launched at the Faculty of Education, somebody came up to me afterwards and said, oh, I work on children's book publishing and children's stories. We need to get scientists that look like everybody in our children's books. Let's talk. Like, that kind of impact is massive. So definitely, yes, we're on board with that. This gentleman's been waiting. Yeah. Okay.
So I had a question about how you actually ran the citizens' juries, because it seems to me you've got two areas of uncertainty. If you take a CRISPR one, you've got uncertainty as to where CRISPR technology is going, how it's going to be developed, how it's going to be used. But on the other side, the ethical side, ethics is not a fixed slide rule proposition. It's very variable. It's developed. There are different ethical viewpoints. You may have 15 people in the room in different stages of development of their own ethical thinking, and the right answer is not necessarily an average of their ethical points. How do you manage those two different sets of uncertainties in the process without producing something that's very bland?
Oh, hopefully it wasn't bland. Yeah. Can I just pick up on just a little phrase that you used there? How do you get the right answer? And who gets to judge what that is? So in this moment, in this citizens' jury, the right answer was what the jury came up with through their lived experience. So we weren't overlaying our perspective of what a robust ethical argument might be, or interpretation of the science. We gave them what we know, the best knowledge that we know, and we let them debate and discuss it. In terms of where the science is going, we keep abreast of the science, and the sentiment is that within 3 to 5 years, CRISPR technologies will be on target and they will be accurate. So one of the concerns about the safety was you change the DNA here, that you have downstream effects on other genes. The sentiment is that that will be resolved fairly quickly. So then it really becomes an ethical question as opposed to can we do it? So how do we balance? Well, we let the jury lead it.
And I think, yeah, I mean, just to follow up as well, I think that's where we have this kind of commitment to being multidisciplinary, and the fact that it's not an attempt to, sideline other forms of expertise in that sense. That there is a significant scientific and ethical, kind of philosophical, academic and policy literature out there. And so those arguments exist in that policy space already, well worked through. What is missing is that voice of kind of how that relates to the values that people live their lives by, which, will draw on different levels of complexity, both scientifically and ethically and theologically and everything else. But that needs to be part of that conversation. I think that's,
And I was relieved by the ethicist who came to brief the jury. He's an academic philosopher, an ethicist at Oxford. And afterwards he said to me, do you know what? Ethics gets really hard really quickly, but at the same time, we all do it every day. And that was a huge relief to me, because I'm not an ethicist, and neither was anybody in the jury. But the point that they'd already got to by halfway through the first day, the fact that they were already tackling what is suffering, how does anyone decide what a serious condition is? They were already going there, even though what they were doing was not necessarily called academic ethics. But it gets really hard really quickly, and we do it every day. Seemed like a great balance to me for holding what I felt about it.
First of all, if I may, congratulations on actually harnessing the money and attention on what I think is a huge gap in our collective management capabilities. I agree wholeheartedly. There are huge changes now possible which can be implemented worldwide with huge effects on the population, and our management systems just not geared to this. So whilst you focused in quite rightly on the multiple science tides that are flowing with many ripples within it, can I perhaps offer a thought on two sideways dimensions to what you're doing? One is, look at what happened this morning. Two people have decided to change the whole economic structure of this country. They've not been challenged. There's been no debate. The BBC are frightened to put out the other 100 economists who say it's rubbish. There's not been the process of evolving the idea, checking that it works, and making sure it can be implemented and accepted. So I suggest your methodology, when you developed it, could easily look at the management policy, whether it's fracking or in the political sphere. One other point, which you may wish to hear, there are two stages to this. The first one is checking the ideas are good and letting the ideas flow back and forward and evolve, the scientific process in practice. But previously it was mechanical, with lots of scientists checking the procedures. Now it's acceptability and how to make it work. So that's the first phase, which is the checking one, which I think your jury is addressing. The second phase is the one which you addressed, which is how on earth you get the population to understand and feel they participated and to welcome it and evolve it, because it won't be right at first. So those two stages might be addressed. Just one final thought on the last stage, which is getting people to understand it and welcome it. I've heard of one case, which was South America, where they were trying to sell population control, birth aids, etc. And the only way they got through to this very strong Roman Catholic environment was to put it into the soap operas, where it was public. So put it on the archers.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Do you want to say something?
I am so pleased you said that, because on the first day of the Kavli Centre back in April, we were invited to speak to various other centres at Cambridge, and I piped up, bright-eyed, I think we should get this as a story on the archers. And you could have heard a pin drop. So that was it's what the French call a grand moment de solitude. And however, at the jury last week, we met a family who had Fanconi anemia in their family, and it's a nasty one, and I'd never heard of it before. And they had managed to get a character with Fanconi anemia written into the soap opera Emmerdale. So every time they went back to perhaps raise awareness or ask for money or do another event, they could always say, oh, but you might have seen so-and-so on Emmerdale. That has massive reach. And I think sometimes academia can be really snobby about what is and isn't acceptable. Yeah. So us saying, oh, we'd like to talk to influencers, or we might want to be on TikTok, or we'd like to have a line in the Archers, you can see some people struggling to adapt to that and say, how is that Cambridge? How is that academic? But it really, really is, because it is mass experience and it is engagement with a human face for everybody, not just people who are lucky enough to be here. That's my answer.
Thank you. My name's Chris Williams. Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. One of the allied aspects of your work perhaps could be the role of artificial mRNA, which many have probably heard the phrase, the software of life is now hackable. That seems to be an equally important area for an ethical discussion, and there doesn't seem to be one going on at all. I'd welcome your comments.
So we will be on the hunt for the next ethically challenging issues raised by cutting edge science. So we are pretty sewn up at the moment for genetics, AI and big data, but we will be on the hunt. And part of Catherine's role will be around going across the university to see where the next big ethical issues are being discussed amongst scientists. Do you want to add to that?
I think one of the things that we want to do, so Anna mentioned the work that we're going to do, so ethnographic, so kind of deep sort of anthropologically inspired work, but spending a lot of time in scientific kind of context, understanding that process of how you become to be a kind of scientist who makes these assessments themselves. And the idea ultimately would be that it's not a case as a centre of kind of dashing from science to science, because within Cambridge alone, I mean, we would need far more people than we could ever have to cover the breadth of scientific activity. But it's about building systems into the scientific education process and training process as well that allow those things to be addressed, not by us, essentially. I mean, it's almost kind of a long-term goal that in many ways we would hope to be redundant, kind of, hopefully not for the foreseeable future, but yeah.
It's also about how you scale up the engagement methods so that you are more inclusive, and how do you radiate across science. So once we have, I mean, this is all an experiment, as I said right at the beginning. Once we have figured out the evidence base, if we can gather it, on how to communicate well about this at scale, then we can hopefully translate that to lots of other areas of science.
And now for the final question.
Hi, thanks very much. And apologies if you covered this because we arrived a little bit late already. What do you think about the debate about genome-edited foods and crops? Obviously, it's very live at the moment. Trialling was deregulated in February, and now legislation being rushed through Parliament to enable commercialisation. Do you believe there's been a sufficient debate with consumers about this to make sure that when it does appear in farmers' fields, which it could do in the next 18 months to 2 years, it will be well received?
Do you want to lead on that?
It's interesting because so I started off talking about so I did my PhD on the first iteration of the GM crop debate, and which was a huge thing. It was everywhere, and this time yeah, I don't know if people have other things on their plate or something. It seems to have kind of, it's gone under the radar slightly. And I think there has been some consultation. There have been some processes, and the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, for example, has done work on it. Empirically, I think it's going to be an interesting thing to see where we are compared to the late 1990s and the early 2000s. My suspicion is that, given the number of other things that are going on in the world, that actually gene-edited food is going to struggle for attention as an issue. But yeah, I know.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me when we started talking to the creatives, we were grappling, like, how do we break through all of the other things that people have got to think about? And he gave this great phrase, which I just love, which is the end of the week comes before the end of the world for most people. In other words, we need to be in a space very much of now. Like, we need to be where the end of the week discussion is happening, rather than positing it like this might happen in the future or whatever. So if we can find a way to talk about GM crops or gene editing in a wider way, but make it as relevant to the end of the week as it is to the end of the world, then we're winning, I think. But we haven't figured that out yet, just so you know.
Right. I think we're out of time.
We're finished. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.